The Winx comics are a long-standing, precious part of the Winx franchise, published alongside the series since its inception, and yet often little acknowledged by the fandom. See, the Winx comics at the beginning were an AU of the Winx franchise, with characters, locations, and world building unto themselves, with independent plot lines, as well as deeper explorations of those from the series. The result was a sincere, self-contained, and relatively consistent alternative Winxverse with magic lore, returning villains, and extended storylines I really think need to be considered when discussing future adaptations and merchandising of the show. So, instead of the 3 hours plus video I had initially planned, I decided to stop being silly and break up this concept into a series of much more digestible, internet-friendly numbered lists for your viewing pleasure. For the first few parts of this series, we are going to be focusing on issues 1 through 100, because 100 is a nice number, and because this more or less corresponds to the pre-reboot era, before the entire franchise gets a rebranding. Consider this video a warm-up round, just introducing some of the peculiarities of the comics, how they relate to the wider franchise, and we will get more and more specific as the series goes on. So, let us begin. It's worth starting with an explanation of how the typical comic plots vary from the show plots. Fans of the first 2 seasons specifically will be glad to hear that a lot of the comics focus on interpersonal relationships and slice-of-life content above anything else. I believe this is mostly due to the constraints of the genre, but also due to some of the individual canon of the comics, particularly relating to the magic system and its limitations, which we will get into in more detail. As far as the constraints of the genre itself, what I mean by that is that the format of the comic book is just not going to lend itself to the extended glittery action sequences of the show. And so the plots either involve the Winx moving from location to location and interacting with their environment to keep it dynamic, or focus on some kind of conflict between characters. You might assume that this also gets repetitive and boring, but overall they keep it pretty fun and creative, and the stakes are surprisingly high sometimes, in the background. Tecna and Timmy are fighting. Meanwhile, a deposed dictator is trying to get revenge on the people who got rid of him by intercepting anti-meteor defense systems. Aisha hasn't gotten to see Naboo in a really long time because he's super busy at this ocean laboratory. Oh, and by the way, a massive alien egg landed on Andros, and this evil paramilitary navy force, some pirates in their really cool ship, and the Winx are looking for it for wildly different reasons. But there are also lower stakes, more grounded stories, and these are also delightful. Literally grounded, the Winx will often spend most of a story in their civilian forms until there is one big problem to solve at the end, for which they will transform. For example, Magics on Ice is about a figure skating competition until the weather magic holding Magics in Winter spirals out of control, so the Winx are called to action. Pandora's Box is about the Winx and the Trix visiting another magic school as exchange students and has themes of anti-bullying, until the Trix release an ancient demon, for funsies. The more grounded plot lines allow for the exploration of Magic City as an urban landscape, and make Magics feel like a real place in which you would want to live. You get to know the local waterside bar, the greenhouse where all the cool indie bands rehearse, the hospital, the news at 10, witch lifestyle. All of this is really charming, and I would think worth taking cues from for the reboot. Now, I know what you are thinking. You are thinking, really? Does the Winx Club really need yet another princess? But put your guillotines away. Princess Tecna is one of the most interesting additions to the comics. In the comics, Tecna is the princess not of Zenith, but of Titania. Her father is the meddlesome King Kryos, who interferes in her love life, and his pressure is the biggest source of tension between her and Timmy. We see that for Titania, over-reliance on technology is harmful in more ways than one, whether it is the planet being completely helpless when robots go on a workers' strike, or King Cryos using an algorithm to determine the ideal partner for his daughter, rather than consider her desires. But it's not all bad. As well as having much love and affection for each other, Tecna and her father are often of one mind when it comes to her royal duties. For example, in issue 53, The Black Comet, Titania is offering aid to a less technologically developed planet, Ethereus, for which a potentially apocalyptic meteorite strike is imminent. The planet has fallen into chaos as a result, so Cryos and Tecna decide that she, and the Winx, will go to the planet as her public appearance as a princess would help assure the panicked populace that everything is under control. This is one of my most favorite stories in the comics. It's got everything: deposed dictators seeking revenge, a hot blue boy trying to seduce Tecna, jewelry that I wished I had when I was a child. As well as being the excuse for some of my favorite plotlines, Tecna's status as a princess in the comics is really a net positive in my opinion. Especially as being a princess is not really a big plotline for the other girls, and the tensions in that regard are not really explored. I mean, Bloom has a part-time job, for God's sake. Unfortunately, this plot point gets retconned around issue 90, where Tecna is no longer a princess and Cryos is the king of Zenith. This in general marks a dip in quality for the comics in my opinion, and would you guess it, it correlates with Viacom acquiring Rainbow. One of the things that really piqued my attention during my rereads in preparation for this series was that the magical dimension, being a coalition of star systems, is not really acknowledged until quite a bit of the way into the comics. Now, of course, this will change from translation to translation, and whether or not the copy is a revised re-release, but for the most part, early on, when characters are referring to each other's points of origin, they don't talk about planets, but kingdoms, dimensions, and even realms. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, the first time a planet other than Earth is visually acknowledged in the comics is not until issue 53, The Black Comet. Rather than interplanetary travel, more often than not, we see the Winx and the specialists do interdimensional travel, through gateways and portals. This interested me because I think I read somewhere that the showrunner for Fate the Winx saga did not watch the show but read the comics, and I've been wondering if this might explain why some of the more sci-fi elements of the show went over his head and were not prioritized in the adaptation. At any rate though, I really enjoy Winx's interdimensional adventures in the comics, especially when there are time shifts between dimensions. My favorites are when the stories take place in medieval adjacent timelines. I know that among what makes Winx special is the fact that they actively forewent the typical pseudo-European medieval fantasy setting. But also, seeing them in this kind of context is fun. The technology fairy in the 14th century. These returning outfits make me wonder if they had originally planned a medieval doll line for Winx, kind of like the comic-exclusive Hallowinx lines.
It's all about me!
Now, like the main show, the comics suffer from extreme Bloom is main character syndrome. In fact, majority of the comics plot lines, if they're not focused on a specific girl, are led by Bloom and Stella. However, I will say that oddly enough, unlike in later seasons, in the comics, Bloom kind of earns her rent as MC, even though it is harder to justify the focus on her because the comic stories aren't about saving Domino at all. Firstly, in personality and ability, Bloom is shown to be the street smarts of the group. This is not necessarily a divergence from the canon of the show, but Bloom is definitely the most cunning of the Winx in the comics, and able to use this gift for mischief to her advantage. For example, in issue 9, Bloom is competing against some witches for a job at a bar, but during the trial run, they take the busiest part of the bar, which is the deck. So what does Bloom do? She messes with the air conditioning to make the air drier inside, making everyone extra thirsty and relieving the owner's rheumatism in the process. Similarly, she is often the one to solve problems, not because she is special, but because of her knowledge of Earth history, which gives her a different perspective from the other girls. For example, in issue 48, the Winx are visiting a technologically underdeveloped realm rampant with crime. because the king cannot afford more soldiers to keep the peace. So Bloom, knowing about the Arthurian legends, proposes that the king start a brotherhood of knights, sworn to keep the peace not for money but for honor and virtue, and because they believe in the cause. It overall just creates a good message around Bloom. It says you don't have to be uniquely talented or extra smart in order to lead or have something to contribute. Just by virtue of being you and of knowing a lot about your interests, for being from a different culture, you have a unique perspective and a lot to offer. This is a good message for Winx's target audience. Secondly, in the comics, Bloom is always the first to comfort the other girls and offer grounding perspective during emotional moments. Now realistically, this is very much again Bloom having main character syndrome. As the MC, she must necessarily be present and involved in the emotional heights of every story. However, within the text itself, this creates the effect that she is the emotional glue of the Winx Club, very much mum of the group energy. And this is the point from which her leadership emerges, not because the other girls defer to her even though she is less educated, less in control, and less knowledgeable than them, but because she brings emotional stability to the group. We are shown that through this, she has gotten to know each of their inner worlds quite well. Now, this is not to say that Bloom is Little Miss Perfect in the comics. No, she is super messy, and I fully intend to get into it in later parts. My favorite thing about Bloom in the comics is that she has a part-time job. Yes, she literally earns her rent. When she first moves to Magix, Bloom does not have any money to spend and ends up looking for work. Flora steals an ad for her, and Bloom starts working for Madame Greta at the White Horse, the most frequently visible non-show location in the comics. The White Horse is a waterside bar at the heart of Magic City, frequented by students of the three schools, as well as fairy traffickers, rich bad boys, rock stars. And Madame Greta herself is something of a motherly presence over the Winx, someone in Magix who keeps an eye on what is going on and can be called for help. It's not just the bar itself that is a key location though, but the piers around it, which you can tell the artists just love, because they are beautiful every time. They make excellent locations for romantic walks or relationship drama. Flora and Helia and Musa and Riven break up here. Musa gets kidnapped here. A witch tries to seduce Brandon here. Roxy, with the help of the Winx, gives a love potion to a guy here. This one is one of the worst storylines. But above anything else, the White Horse and the lake just kind of serve the same purpose as the Fruity Music Bar and the beach in Season 4. A de facto clubhouse, somewhere to gather on the weekends, and a versatile location for storytelling. One whose lack I feel in the main show, I think. The universe of Winx is so outlandish and spectacular that as an adult, I really appreciate the grounding moments of the comics that romanticize everyday life too, like preparing for exams or working part-time jobs. Bloom is not the only one, by the way. Musa has one too. We will get to that. Now, unfortunately, like with any story that has to come out on a monthly basis with no set plan or estimation of timeline, the comics suffer from certain issues. When the stories are good, they're really good, and you can feel the sincerity of the creative team behind them. However, you can just tell that whenever they didn't have any inspiration, any bright new ideas for the month, they just went, whatever, let's just do relationship drama. On occasion, there is some well-handled, interesting conflict between some of the characters and new, compelling love interests. However, when it lasts only one issue, you know it's going to be bad. Most of the time, it requires all of the characters acting, well, out of character, and the girls getting distracted from their boyfriends thanks to some new random hot guy on the scene, only to have to do the walk of shame back to their boyfriends by the end of the issue for brand consistency reasons or whatever. For example, issue 41, Love Beach, gives us the randomest, unnecessariest Tecna and Timmy drama, like ever, where Tecna is just really mad at Timmy for wanting to do well at the surfing competition to prove himself worthy of her, the Princess of Titania. And then she goes off with this guy Jonas? Why? although it does give us this problematic but kind of iconic Tecna moment. Yeah, Tecna is violent in the comics. Now, there are a few instances where the relationship conflict is actually interesting, and one of the most well-handled instances of this is the Mission to Andros arc. Naboo is assistant to a marine biologist, Professor Torganis, helping conduct his oceanic studies and taking care of his sickly daughter, Helicia, who has fallen in love with him in the process. Naboo remains loyal to Aisha, but he also feels deeply conflicted because Helicia in her delicate condition depends on him. Aisha does suffer for this, but she does not take it out on either of them because she understands the situation. In the end, the three of them handle it maturely, and it's overall realistic and thoughtfully done, in my opinion. I think it helps that rather than being the focus of the plot, this storyline sits inside a bigger one about alien eggs, pirates, and deep-sea exploration. This arc also gives us Pirate Aisha, God bless. Diaspro fans rejoice, for the comics have plenty of bonus Diaspro content. In the comics, Diaspro is not just someone in the royal court of Heraklion who happens to also have the title of princess, but actually a crown princess with her own kingdom which to inherit one day. Through the comics, we see that Sky's affections is not just a petty, trivial thing for her. Despite trying to come to terms with Sky's commitment to someone else, and even finding respect and camaraderie with Bloom, she really can't help continuing to desire his love and attention. We also get a sense of the familial pressures on the two of them, and see that it is not so simple for Sky either. When Diaspro comes to study at Althea, only to fall ill thanks to a curse by the Trix, Sky is unusually dedicated to her whilst she convalesces, suggesting that whatever it is, this connection is also important to him. I even, get the sense that they might actually make the better match together. Now, I'm not going to lie, it might just be because I really don't like Bloom and Sky together in the comics. Bloodrian forever. But especially with Bloom's princess status not being hugely emphasized, it really sometimes feels like Bloom is just clueless when it comes to his royal duties, or even just his life and emotional landscape. See, the war on Heraklion is a big recurrent plotline in the comics, lasting several issues, and it is finally over in issue 79, where Sky and Brandon can finally return to magics and their studies. So, to celebrate, Stella and Bloom throw a silly hat party. Their boyfriends are back from war and massacre, and they're just like, don't forget to make a hat, okay? And then Diaspro shows up, prompting Bloom to throw a jealous fit. Diaspro has been in the trenches as a fellow commander in the Heraklion army, fighting side by side with Sky and Brandon. Meanwhile, Bloom has been living the good life in magics, as she kind of should, and has been having other flirtations, which is also fine. I think you really don't have to stay with your first teenage boyfriend, especially as Sky doesn't treat Bloom very well in the comics. This issue kind of solidifies for me that Comic Bloom and Comic Sky, who are again quite different from the series, are just not meant to be together. Not because Bloom is not worthy of him or something, but simply because they're just not a good match. And in turn, Sky and Diaspro just seem like the better match, politically, but also because they've been through some shit together. The Winx are much less overpowered in the comics because of the different magic system as well as specific environmental limitations, all of which we will get into in more detail in future parts. But let's get to one of those limitations itself, the Shaab Stone. The Shaab Stone is a meteor that struck magic some years ago, the properties of which can counteract magic. The area where fragments of it have scattered and its dust has been absorbed into the water, the earth, and the air is called the enclosed territory, where no magic is effective at all. It's interesting to compare the enclosed territory to the wildlands in Season 2, also an area of magics where magic doesn't work. Many villains naturally covered the Shaab Stone for its magic cancelling properties, whether it is an evil businessman trying to terrorize Madame Griffin, rebels from Heraklion hiding out in the Magic's mountains, or even pirates on the Andros Oceans. The failure to prevent the main part of the stone from falling in the hands of the evil Trade Magics Company gets Helia expelled from Red Fountain for a time. At one point, some villains infect the water supply of Althea with bits of the stone, effectively taking out the entire school because they want to kidnap Bloom's dragon friend, who is a recurring character in Season 1 adjacent comics. The stone is one of the most frequently reappearing magical objects, alongside Bloom's diary and Morgana's necklace. The Winx being way less powerful in the comics has both positive and negative effects in my opinion. On the one hand, I like the limitations, I like the expansion of the magic lore. On the other hand, it does kind of lead to situations where the Winx are pathetically useless, whilst the sheer brawn of the specialists is never going to be so ineffective in the same way. This, combined with other factors, namely Stella, creates problems in the messaging that we will also have to get into sometime. The comics offer plenty of new characters, as well as expand on background characters from the show. There are multiple reoccurring characters whose stories deserve their own sections and explanations, but there are also one-off characters who really steal the show. Often, new female characters are introduced as a friend of one of the girls, calling on them for help to resolve a situation on their planet or dimension. For example, Flora's friend Laurel is lady-in-waiting to a queen of a feudal realm, and asks for the Winx's support in dealing with crime and poverty. Tecna's childhood friend Iris calls on Tecna because she suspects a robot rebellion, and she is in love with her sexy robot Memox. This expands on both the childhood backgrounds of the girls as well as the rules of the universe, because often their friends who knew them in childhood interestingly are surprised to find that the girls are now fairies. For example, Jessie, with whom Flora went to school, but who does not hail from Linfea like her. The show never explains the difference between magic and non-magic people who live in the magical dimension, so this is an interesting step on the way. Some of the girls also have witch friends who are only really mentioned in passing, but I do like this as an emphasis on how each of the girls have lives outside the Winx Club too. We also get to know about background characters, such as Lucrezia, a witch who is in fact in the show. Lucrezia stars in a story about the witches of Cloud Tower getting addicted to magic sweets en masse as they deal with the stresses of the exam period. As far as don't do drugs kids stories go, this one is actually pretty good in my opinion. Let's not forget Marcia, who has more chemistry with Aisha in one panel than any of her love interests do in their entire lives. Or Karel, who is a specialist in the show, but a recluse in the comics, living in the Mountains of Magics, with a secret. He is also teased as a Flora love interest. Speaking of Flora's love interests, I have to give a shout out to my boy Igor, because little figure skating loving me was begging Flora to go for it, even though he gives us nothing. Igor is the son of the mayor of Magic City, Mayor Diamond, and the world male figure skating champion. I don't know which world exactly, they don't say. At any rate, there are plenty of new minor characters in the comics to obsess over and dream about their one day making it onto the show. One of the biggest divergences in the canon of the comics is that the Trix are allowed to continue their studies at Cloud Tower. Now, the main events of the show are actually acknowledged in the comics, usually quite briefly and dismissively through the medium of someone telling it to someone else, usually Bloom to her diary. And yet the Trix and the Winx continue to have adventures together and collaborate well into the Believix era, which gets a little funny. But as far as how the Trix are forgiven post-season 2, it's quite fun. The Trix survive the cave-in at Darkar's fortress and are hiding out, but wishing to get back into the world. They decide to create a spell that will wipe out everyone's memories so that they can reintegrate into society, They cook up a potion whose steam can make people forget things, but they actually fall into the potion themselves and get their minds completely wiped. It is decided that they will be allowed to return to school since they don't remember what they did wrong, but of course they are alienated very quickly because everyone else remembers and treats them as outcasts as a result. In the comics, the Winx and the Trix have adventures together, getting sent, for example, to other magic schools as exchange students, or to another planet which is facing rising water levels due to global warming. By the way, Icy tries to refreeze the glaciers, but it doesn't work. All through this, the Trix and the Winx maintain a competitive enmity, and I really like this dynamic, and I was hoping it was the kind of thing that could have been done in Fate before, it got cancelled. The differences in canon between the comics, the show, and the books are the main reason why I really don't mind that different eras of Winx have variations or contradictions between them. Yes, I want internal consistency from a story, but as far as different eras and mediums go, it really doesn't bother me. In fact, I like it. It's like fairy tale characters or comic book superheroes whose stories get told again and again and change every time. So, I am predicting at least 2 more parts to this series. This one was just to introduce the more general rules of the universe for the comics and some peculiarities to whet your appetite. But we will be getting more and more specific regarding different plot lines, original characters, and some problems that the comics have, namely Stella. One thing I'm excited to get into is actually how the comics handle post-season 4 plotlines, because I think they give us an idea of the original vision Rainbow had for magic returning to Earth after season 4, before the Nickelodeon deals. I hope I've gotten you interested in learning more about the comics and you're looking forward to all of that. So, perhaps I shall see you next time. Bye! Oh, and by the way, somewhere at some point in the Winx comics, a T-Rex plows a field. And I just wanted you to know that.